The 1980s and 1990s brought us some of the most iconic and memorable films in cinema history. Although some went on to have sequels that weren't as highly praised as the originals, they mostly remain as concrete and worthy sequels in those 2 decades of pure Hollywood magic. As a continuation from my previous videos, which were of course the best movie tie-in games that don't suck, as well as the best arcade movie tie-in games, this video is looking at the not so wonderful games which were based on the biggest films of those 2 decades. This video then, on the contrary, is highlighting some of the absolute worst movie game tie-ins, games that simply shouldn't have been put for sale at the time, as well as some which were completely pointless or even so bad that they would make you rage in pure frustration. So today, and as part 3 of this series, we are checking out 10 of the very worst movie game tie-ins ever made, in which we'll look at several different genres of film, as well as using a range of different computer and console platforms to showcase some of these disaster pieces. But before we start, please don't expect to see E.T. That game has frankly been done to death, and there is actually much worse out there. That is to say, more utterly repulsive cash grabs that you might not necessarily be aware of. If you were a Commodore format reader when Dick Tracy released for the Commodore 64, you could well remember that issue 6 explains that it was the lowest rated game they have ever reviewed at that point. Dick Tracy was released on several platforms for its 1990 cinema release and had a couple of different gameplay styles, but specifically, out of how bad most of them were regardless of platform, the C64 version in particular is what we are looking at here, and the reason being is that it truly is an awful and unfinished mess that should have never been released. I really don't know where to start with it. Now, ZX Spectrum fans will know that color clash is a thing as for hardware limitations. It's not really something that is seen much on the C64 because, very simply put, the Commodore 64 isn't a ZX Spectrum. As we walk slowly through the ugly looking levels, you'll notice that Dick Tracy can sometimes appear to be blending into the background. His yellow coat is the exact same colour as the yellow walls, and as we walk through these, you'll notice that all we can see of Dick is everything else that isn't this colour, and a good portion of the sprite is actually yellow. You'll also notice that as we walk along, he actually has a line through the middle of his body in which the background shows through it. It kind of reminds me of Melbourne House's Double Dragon for the C64. You'll notice with this pathetic game that hit collision detection doesn't always work, and so when hitting baddies, you are actually hitting thin air as it doesn't always register. The sprites are truly ugly here on every level imaginable. The music at times makes you feel like you're living in a padded cell. It truly is awful. Like I said, the game quite simply put should never have been released to begin with in the state that it's in. It's a broken mess which even struggles to keep the game's music properly running at times. It kind of feels like even the music itself has had enough of it all. It's very possible that this is literally the worst ever Commodore 64 game film tie-in ever made, period. I would even say that Red Heat was better than this game, and that was absolutely atrocious. RoboCop has had a history of a few fairly decent games, such as the arcade game of the original film, and a few home computer versions, such as RoboCop 3 for the Amiga, but there certainly was a load of rubbish in between, and RoboCop 2 certainly was a film that you either loved or hated it, as it had nothing over the original film, but any RoboCop fan will tell you that regardless of loving or hating it, it was most certainly better than the abomination of what we ended up with RoboCop RoboCop 3. So this is the NES version of RoboCop 2. It was also released on a few other platforms. The 8-bit versions of RoboCop 2 was different to what the 16-bit versions received. The 8-bit versions truly were terrible. The name Ocean will crop up a fair amount in this video, and that's who released this game in 1990. Firstly then, just like the Commodore 64 version of this game, the NES game almost feels like RoboCop is walking on ice. He slides around rather than coming to a complete halt when you let go of the joystick. We need to destroy Nuke in this game, which are scattered around the level. That sounds simple enough, to just walk into objects marked with an N, and it could have been. Only once we scroll forward, we cannot go back to collect the nuke, and so collecting the quota of nuke to pass the first level can be near damn impossible because of this. We can see it, but we cannot get it because of this problem. We even randomly have nuke which appears on a tiny platform below a bridge, which seems either impossible to get full stop, or was just placed there by mistake. Regardless, the game is just awful because of this. In having RoboCop who slides around adds to the annoyance of playing this game. If we fail collecting a quota of nuke, then we go to a shooting range, which is randomly outside somewhere. And any RoboCop fan will know that when RoboCop needs to practice or recalibrate things, he goes to the police station to do this, and not outside. Although he did do this in the original RoboCop film, but this was in a worn out industrial site of where he was originally murdered as Alex Murphy. The game is just terrible. The 16-bit versions aren't too bad, but were also heavily criticised for their high difficulty levels.
Welcome to Fright Night.
Fright Night, one of my favourite horror films of the 1980s. The music is incredible, the storyline and characters are some of the best, and the humour is nicely executed too throughout the film. I know this film inside out, and I even own the LP of the soundtrack, as well as having a Fright Night picture on my wall. Yes, I dearly love it. And one of the best modern vampire interpretations around, which escapes that dated original vampire formula. The film involves Charlie Brewster, who finds odd things happening with his new next door neighbours. We then meet Peter Vincent, the great vampire killer, played by the legendary Roddy McDowall, who is a TV character and whose show is called Fright Night. To cut a long story short, they pair up and take down Jerry Dandridge, who is the vampire living next door. So we then have a game, and this is exclusive to Amiga. It was literally released for nothing else and has largely been forgotten about through time. Some films really needed no game, and this is seriously one of them. We play as Jerry Dandridge and walk around his house. We randomly find Charlie and Peter, who we need to walk into to suck their blood whilst they're trying to attack us, throwing crucifixes at us. We have generic and stereotypical horror music, which sounds nothing like the music from the film. We have a layout for Jerry's house which looks nothing like the layout from the film. After killing the people in our house, we then move on to the next day where it says, "You survived." We then start all over again, and it gradually gets more difficult as the game goes on. We have generic or horror style things in this game, such as hands coming out the floor, which again never happens in the film. This utterly pointless game released in 1988 by Microdeal. I am sure I don't need to explain what Home Alone 2 Lost in New York is about, and I'm also aware it's nowhere near Christmas yet, but this NES 1992 game by THQ seriously needs calling out at this point. This is a terrible game, and after playing it again after many years of trying to avoid it for that very reason, this game is still an awful game. It wasn't just the NES that this game was developed for. Game Boy and even the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive had versions of it, which are all frankly just as terrible. As a kid, I was very likely in the know at the time that the sound effects in this game are ripped straight from Bart vs. the Space Mutants, the NES version that is. You can hear it when Kevin jumps, as he collects things, and most certainly when he is hit. This game was actually developed by the same development team known as Imagineering, who developed both games. They could have at least done something different to make Home Alone 2 for the NES sound different. The Simpsons game has a distinct sound, and it is very clear it is the same with Home Alone 2. It's almost off-putting. Now, besides the music and sound effects being fairly annoying, the storyline is bizarre too. In this storyline, Marv and Harry call a hotel where Kevin is staying and plan to trap or capture him. And of course, this is very different to how the film actually goes. Throughout the game, we are jumping over grannies, suitcases which seem to be possessed as they independently move around to harm you. We have the ability to go inside of doors or shops to snoop around for gadgets to use against the grannies or whatever bizarre enemy arises. And to be fair, most of these weapons are kind of useless, especially the necklace, which has a terrible throwing range. We can screw for our inventory with the select button, again pretty much like Bart vs the Space Mutants. It's a horrible game that sounds and looks terrible, a typical example of one of those massive blockbuster films where a cash grab game was made with little care of the final product. Next up is the excruciatingly terrible Red Heat, which, surprise surprise, is another ocean game. I actually did a whole video on every version of this game some time back too, and that was painful as each version was pretty much the same, only with better visuals on some particular platforms. The game itself is the same on every platform, and on every platform is utterly shocking. A quick rundown of the Arnold Schwarzenegger film itself, for those not in the know, it's essentially one of those 80s buddy cop films where an unlikely couple of cops get together. In this case, Arnie plays Ivan Danko, a Soviet cop who travels to America to find his colleague's killer, who happens to be a kingpin, whilst James Belushi plays a character known as Ridzik, who coincidentally gets assigned to the same case as Arnie's character. It's a typical film of the era, and not particularly one of Arnie's best of the decade either. So as you see in the gameplay, this is of course the ZX Spectrum version of the game, and it truly is as boring as it looks. We get a cinematic presentation where Arnie's lower half, as well as enemies' lower body parts, are hidden away. Each level in the game is the same. We move forward, or attempt to move forward, as we are battered by enemies constantly pinning us in the corner of the screen as many come to attack you. In most cases, and in this version, hit collision detection is truly awful, and the controls are very clunky too. We can pick up objects as we slowly scroll through the levels, which sometimes don't even register that you're pressing forward to collect these random things. We at times get a burst of bullets heading our way which we cannot duck or even avoid getting hit by. The game all released roughly around the same time, and like I say, they are all truly bad games. When I said surprise surprise, it's another Ocean game with Red Heat, this is exactly what I meant. Ocean Software was by far no stranger to putting out terrible film to game tie-ins, and Dennis is likely one of the better known terrible games in this list. This absurd game released in 1993 for the Super Nintendo, Game Boy and the Amiga, which had an AGA version. The film itself was okay, nothing particularly special, and it's largely been forgotten about over the years, with not even a mention of any remake or anything else. A typical troublesome but lovable kid who causes typical boy-like trouble for his neighbour, Mr. Wilson. You know the story. Oddly enough, here in the UK, Dennis can be a little confusing as we have a comic book known as Dennis the Menace in Nasher, and it's a completely different thing to the American Dennis the Menace. Anyways, as for this game, it's just god-awful. A game I played as a kid on my SNES, which I likely tried to enjoy at the time, but in reality, it truly is shockingly bad. We have platforms in the game where it appears that we can jump on them, but we just jump through them, such as tables. We have not so obvious things we need to jump on to reach higher objects, such as coins. We also have a few weapons, such as a water pistol and slingshot, and most of the time, these don't actually do anything. anything. You would assume that squirting water at a cat might make it run away or even kill it. Not with this game. They just carry on like nothing has even happened. It seems that some enemies like bats can be killed with weapons, but others cannot be. It's just either confusing or just clearly broken. Talking about broken, the music is what I would say as annoying as a broken record. I mean, really, this game had the qualities of being something half decent. The visuals are decent enough, but as a game, it makes no sense, and Dennis sounds like an old dude when he is hit. If you wasted hours playing this growing up, then you truly weren't alone. Many of us suffered with this game. If you have never seen this pitiful excuse of a game before, well, this is Ocean Software's Highlander, and this is the Commodore 64 release specifically. Ocean also released it for the Amstrad CPC as well as the ZX Spectrum, all of which were slammed fairly badly at the time, and here I am personally slamming it all of this time later in 2025. So what is Highlander? It's considered a cult classic these days, although on its theatrical release back in 1986, it was considered as a bit of a failure at the time. It made just under $13 million in the box office and was made at $19 million. Let me give this some context. The original and awesome Crocodile Dundee also released in 1986 and was made at a mere $8.8 million and had a box office success of $328 million. Top Gun also released the same year, and you can imagine the success of that film too. So yeah, Highlander was off to a bad start from the get-go, even with the film, let alone this miserable Ocean game to go with it. Now, seriously, what you see is what you get here, a complete and utter pathetic mess of a game that happens to have the legendary Martin Galway's name on it, as he produced the music for the game. And this really is the best thing about Highlander. Just load it up and listen to Galway, but don't actually play it. Of course, extremely oversized sprites which look shockingly bad, a control system as we fight against the opponent that doesn't really make much sense. If you happens to beat the opponent, then it is simply down to pure luck, just like what happened to me whilst recording this video. The sound effects whilst we are sword fighting sounds much like ping pong, where the ball bounces off walls making a sound. Let's just say it sounds like something reminiscent of a late 1970s game. This game is a disaster on every level. Everybody loves Back to the Future. The trilogy is awesome and an absolute joy to watch for most people. They are quality films and very cleverly written films. Sure, Back to the Future 3 wasn't as great as the first two films, but it's definitely not a film that is known to be terrible. The Back to the Future games are terrible, well, up until 2010, where Back to the Future had a new game and was actually playable. In general, the original run of the games from the 1980s and early 90s are known to be all bad. This is specifically Back to the Future Part 3 on Sega Mega Drive. I haven't touched this game in years, and playing it again makes me realise why that is. This is the most infuriating game on the Sega Mega Drive, and likely you will watch this and feel the pain. That frustration and pure anger that galloping along the first level of the game brings is totally real here. We need to catch up with Clara and rescue her on the horse just like in the film. The issue is that this is near impossible to achieve. I didn't beat it in the early 90s and I cannot beat it here in 2025 either. It's just impossible and there is no need for its sheer difficulty level. Arena released this godforsaken abomination in 1991 and I would imagine that many kids who played this at the time raged in anger like myself. The objects that we need to duck from and jump over while shooting backwards to fend off Mad Dog and his gang are just far too much here. It's like the objects that we need to dodge are at times so close together that we end up falling off the horse that Doc is riding on. Really, if you can make it past the first bridge without the aid of a Game Genie cheat, my hat's off to you. Something even more annoying is of course the darkened colour. This game, or at least in some parts of the world, was actually released like this at the time. I had the PAL version back in the day and remember it looking like this at the time. Legend has it that Back to the Future Part 3 has a few different style levels after beating the first level, which almost makes it seem like a minigame compilation. If one day you feel like getting angry but cannot find anything to make you feel angry, then play Back to the Future Part 3 on Mega Drive and you will get what you need in less than 60 seconds. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was a film I'd loved to watch growing up. 2 films in one whilst documenting Michael Jackson's early day in the spotlight with, say, the Jackson 5. It was pretty much a film dedicated for fans with an awesome soundtrack, and videos included one of my personal favourites from Bad, which was Speed Demon. Some fairly good animation for the time too, where Michael dresses up as a bunny to avoid the paparazzi and utterly obsessed fans. It was a great film during an era where big stars at the time felt it was necessary to go into film. David Bowie had an awesome film such as Labyrinth and a couple of others that he actually did, and Paul McCartney had Give My Regards to Broad Street and so on. We had an awesome arcades game for a Moonwalker, which most people loved and still do love, and we had a Mega Drive version of Moonwalker, which wasn't that bad, although a little repetitive as most would argue. We then had the US Golden releases for 8-bit and 16-bit computers. This of course is the Amstrad CPC release. This is likely one of the most boring games you'll ever play. It kind of reminds me of Pac-Man, especially the first stage, as you will see in the gameplay. The aim of level 1 then is to easily get annoyed with the constant 8-bit chiptune interpretation of Bad, whilst walking around pathways looking for objects to pass the level. As we collect objects, Michael's image on the right hand side of the screen begins changing. We also have paparazzi and fans to avoid. Like I said, kind of like the same thing as Pac-Man, or at least the principle of it. Collect things around a maze whilst avoiding baddies. We have a map highlighting where objects are located, but most of the time, by attempting to follow the map, leads you to dead ends. It's a relentlessly boring game to play, and it just drags and drags and drags. I have never made it past the first level out of sheer boredom. The music itself just doesn't help the boredom. Rather than encourage you to play more, it just makes you feel like turning the game off, which is exactly what I did. We are going to end this video off today with a film game tie-in that is pretty damn atrocious, and that is Batman Forever, which released for several platforms, including that very bizarre R-Zone short-lived console which Argos once sold. If you remember the hype around the release of Batman Forever back in 1995, you'll also remember all of the merch which came with it. I even had a Batman Forever themed cassette tapes at the time, and what made this film likely even more popular was the fact that Jim Carrey starred in it as the Riddler, and of course at the time of this film releasing, Jim Carrey was huge amongst teenagers in particular. As a film itself, for me, it was a little bit of a disappointment, as we suddenly went from Tim Burton's reimagining of Gotham City and back to the hyper neon comic book style film, more like the original 1960s Batman TV series. There was of course an arcade game and a couple of 32-bit ports which were fairly criticised at the time and very different to what the console's got, but we are looking at the SNES version, and it's interesting adopting that Mortal Kombat fighting engine and the digitized sprites to give the game that more realistic look, which at the point of development was already clear that 16-bit consoles could not do this too well, with the exception of Donkey Kong Country of course. The game itself is fairly bad. What makes it very frustrating is that there are times where we do not have any clear indication of where to go, as most of the time things are so dark and it's hard to see things too. Gadgets that we can select from the options screen before the game starts just don't work very well, as you'll see from the gameplay footage, as the controls are also a complete mess. I played this game as a young teenager and ended up just giving up with it, and here we are in 2025 and around 3 minutes into the game and I've already done the same again. Now, by no means is this video every worst game ever made. There will be another part of this coming soon. So which game based on the film was your absolute nightmare? Let us know in the comments, and if you've not watched the best film to game tie-ins, then be sure to check those out. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.